Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining this AdSense on Air session. My name is Irina, and I will talk to you today about how to fight against fraud and how to protect your revenue with ads.txt. But before we jump into the agenda for the day, I just wanted to briefly remind you of the links where you can register for this kind of session, as well as the link where you can ask your questions, even throughout the presentation. If there's something you would like more clarification on or more information on, feel free to send the questions. Also, at the end of the session, you'll receive a feedback survey. I want to invite you to give us your feedback, your opinion, and as well to let you know you will be receiving a copy of the presentation we'll be going through. With that in mind, I can walk you through the agenda for this session right now. So first of all, we're going to talk about ads.txt, what it is and why it's important, as a reminder for everyone, and also as setting the stage in order to understand the implication and the importance of this standard. Then I'm going to walk you through how to create an ads.txt file for your site, how to troubleshoot common implementation issues, as well as providing additional news about Google's support for ads.txt files placed on subdomains, as well as some very recent news about ads.txt for apps, which was very recently shared a couple of days ago by the AIB. So moving on, what is ads.txt? Why is it relevant? Why do we need it? Ads.txt stands for Authorized Digital Sellers. It is a standard, an initiative that was born with the backing of the AIB. It's an industry-level standard that helps ensure that your digital ad inventory is only sold through sellers which you authorize to do so, which you've identified as authorized. Creating your own ads.txt file gives you more control over who's allowed to sell your ads and helps prevent counterfeit inventory from being presented to advertisers. The ads.txt standard was created to increase transparency overall in the digital ecosystem. By letting website owners publicly declare who is allowed to sell their inventory, who has that mandate, that authorization. It helps ad technology companies identify unauthorized and domain spoofed inventory, and it helps prevent that from being sold across the industry. So what is counterfeit inventory? Because we spoke about fraud, about counterfeit inventory, and what is essentially the problem that ads.txt is trying to solve. The project aims to prevent various types of counterfeit inventory across the digital programmatic supply chain. The main ones are domain spoofing or selling illegitimate inventory. And by that, we mean inventory which is sourced from a domain or an app or video, but it is intentionally mislabeled or offered for sale as a different domain or an app or video. There could be different motivations for doing that. For example, attracting higher prices by mislabeling inventory as brand inventory, or by bypassing different types of content or domain blacklists, or to capture advertising spend, which otherwise would be restricted or directed towards whitelisted domains, among others. So when a brand advertiser buys media through programmatic channels, they rely on the fact that the URLs that they purchase were legitimately sold by the publishers that own them. The problem is there is currently no way for a buyer to confirm who is responsible for selling those impressions across exchanges, which is why ads.txt was born. And what does this file include? What is the information provided in this file? For each SSP or exchange or network that you work with, there is the file includes one line, including 4 fields of data. 3 of them are mandatory and 1 of them is optional. The first one is the exchange domain, or the SSP domain, followed by the seller account ID, or publisher ID, as it's also called, which is basically the ID associated with the publisher's account on an exchange or an SSP platform. The third one is the payment type. Payment type currently has two options, direct or reseller, and others might be added in the future. And last, the optional field is the certification authority ID. You can include that or not. It would not affect the function of the file, the functionality of it. So how does it work? Ads.txt works by creating a publicly accessible record of authorized digital sellers for publisher inventory that buyers can index and reference when they buy inventory and when they want to only purchase from authorized sellers. So first, the publishers post these ads.txt file on their domains, authorizing sellers. And then programmatic buyers can crawl the web for publisher ads.txt files, and then they can use that information, create a list of authorized sellers for each participating publisher, and filter to match that list whenever they get an ad request. This helps both publishers and advertisers or buyers, because from a publisher perspective, counterfeit inventory comes in many forms, but generally it redirects advertising spend to counterfeit inventory, to spoofed domains, to further away from legitimate inventory, which with this new authorization mechanism in place would get a higher share of spend. And for exchanges and for advertisers, by creating a more transparent system, there is more accountability and there is more confidence. So everyone wins. Now, if we think about the data included in the file, which I just mentioned, which are the possible segments or the inventory segments? First of all, publishers can either participate or not participate by publishing their ads.txt files. If they participate, if they publish an ads.txt file, the inventory can either be authorized when a certain publisher ID or seller ID is present in the file that is published, and this is the first case, or it can be unauthorized if the domain has an ads.txt file published, but a certain publisher ID or a seller ID that an ad request is coming from is not listed in that domain, which means the inventory is unauthorized or can potentially be counterfeit. And for the publishers who haven't yet published an ads.txt file, those are classified as non-participating, without a live implementation of the file. Why are those three segments important, and why did I mention them to you? Because Google has taken a strong stance as far as ads.txt is concerned, backing by this initiative and encouraging both publishers and advertisers to adopt it and to use it in the programmatic transactions. This means that from the beginning, from the early stages of the launch in November 2017, buyers, agencies, marketers from Google's advertising platforms, back then known as Google AdWords and DoubleClick Bid Manager, they stopped buying unauthorized impressions. So if, as I mentioned before, on a domain there is an ads.txt file, but certain pub IDs or seller IDs are not present, and ad requests come from those, including those IDs, this would not be bought through Google's advertising platforms. Later on, mid last year, Google has launched a new option allowing advertisers to filter out even the category of non-participating publishers, so to only buy authorized inventory if they choose to do so at the level of each campaign or each placement that they have. So now on the display and video 360, which is the new name for double-click bid manager, buyers can choose to do that, have this option. And as there is a wider adoption of ads.txt by both advertisers and publishers, we plan to make this the default setting for buyers. So this will become even more relevant in the future. So let's see, how can you create your ads.txt file? The first thing you would need to do is to identify your publisher ID. And in AdSense, this is very easy. You go into your account in the account information section and identify it. It's the first field you see. And after having that, you simply need to create a text file, include the line with those 4 fields I mentioned, 3 mandatory, 1 optional. Make sure, of course, the pub ID reflects your pub ID, the one you found previously in your account. And then you have to host that file on the root domain of your website. By root domain here, we define or we mean 1 level down from the public suffix list. So, for example, and this is what the AIP ads.txt specification defines as a root domain. For example, Google co.uk or google.com. This would be a root domain. So your example.com website is a root domain. But if you go 1 level down, for example, maps.google.com, this would not be a root domain anymore. This would be considered a subdomain. And we'll treat that in just a little later in the presentation. I'll give you more information about subdomains, but just for the purpose of this point, I just want to mention that placing only an ads.txt file at the level of a subdomain is not sufficient. You need to have an ads.txt file on the root domain, defining all the relevant information as described in the instructions. The second step we would recommend in your AdSense account is to turn on site authorization. It can happen that your code is copied on a website that you don't own or don't manage. Site authorization, what does it do? It ensures your ad code only works on the site that you marked as verified, which means it's protected from any kind of malicious or accidental use by others. And when site authorization is turned on, we also use your verified list of sites to filter the ads.txt alerts that you receive. So there might be instances, and we'll go through that in the troubleshooting section, but there might be instances when you get some alert for websites you don't own or you don't manage, and this is pretty easy to avoid or make sure they are turned off by authorizing your correct website. And in order to do that, you just need to go into your account, My Sites, in the Manage Sites page, click on Site Authorization, and switch on an option that is called Only Authorize My Verified Sites to use my ad code. Then you click Save, and you're all set. How can you check? You've gone through all the steps, you've created your ads.txt file. How can you check that everything is in order, everything is okay? AdSense will alert you. We'll send you an alert in the account, very well highlighted, to tell you if your file needs to be updated. If we detect an issue, for example, your publisher ID missing from the file or not being correctly recognized. If you use Google Ad Manager as a product, then there you have an ads.txt generator available, as well as a validator. And if your ads.txt file is present on the website and someone who's not authorized tries to sell your inventory, then Ad Manager or AdSense or both of them will block those impressions from the auctions. In terms of what the numbers look like, the transparency and simplicity and effectiveness of the ads.txt standard has helped publishers adopt it widely and at an accelerated pace. So since the beginning of this year, we've seen a very strong adoption. More than 500,000 website domains have added an ads.txt file to verify their inventory and to authorize their sellers. And as more publishers adopt it, as I was mentioning before, the price of premium publisher inventory is likely to continue to increase, and the money that is currently spent on spoofed domains or counterfeit inventory gets redirected to legitimate publishers. So this is very important for you to know, to understand, and I hope it's a very convincing reason to make you aware of why it's useful to publish an ads.txt file. Now, you might have attempted, or you might have to do so, or you might have run into some technical errors. So in the next few slides, I'd like to walk you through some of the common implementation issues that we've seen and what the solutions to those are. So first of all, if you're going into your AdSense account, the first thing to check is whether you do have an alert or not. That is including the text you see on the slide. Earnings at risk, one or more of your ads.txt file doesn't contain your AdSense publisher ID. Fix this now. If you don't see this alert, then and you do have an ads.txt file posted, then it means everything is fine, or likely you've run into no error or no issue. Everything is formatted correctly and you're all set. If you do see this error, the next question is whether the websites you see in the alert are websites you own and manage or not. If they're not, then, as I was mentioning before, our recommendation is to simply turn on site authorization and verify your correct website. And then the alerts for websites you haven't verified, you don't own or manage, will disappear or not be visible in the interface anymore. If you do own the website that you see alerts from, then this is where you absolutely need to take an action and make sure the ads.txt file is formatted correctly in order to avoid any kind of risks of potentially losing out on earnings or on your monetization revenue because of this kind of error. There are a number of factors that might lead to technical issues or errors in the implementation or the upload of the file. And I'll tell you more about the common ones. But before that, just to explain what the process is in the backend. So once your ads.txt file is set up on your domain, the Google crawler will attempt to crawl it every 24 hours. And then the crawler will parse the content in order to identify the correct seller IDs and make sure they are listed as authorized for your domain. But there could be factors or formatting errors that can impede with this process. And in order to ensure that your file can be crawled, which is the most important thing, we recommend working through a few troubleshooting steps. First of all, make sure the file is not temporarily unavailable. There could be issues around 404 type of error. And I'm going to list a few elements that might be a bit technical. What I would recommend is to work with your webmaster, if you work with a webmaster, to sort through them, or to make sure that when you generate the file, you use ads.txt generator or a widget, depending on your CMS or the way you work with your website, to make sure you avoid some of the errors I'm presenting. Another common issue is the file is not reachable from the root domain, or there is let's say, a chain of redirects that is too long or is incorrectly set up, and the file is not easily reachable from the root domain of the website. This is also an issue that that impedes the correct crawl of an ads.txt file. Also, make sure the crawling is not disallowed by robots.txt. Make sure it's turned on correctly. Ensure the file is returned with an HTTP 200 OK status code. So you might need to make sure the file has a HTTP 200 OK status code. And very important and very common among what we've seen as errors, make sure there are no formatting errors. Sometimes it can be something as little as a blank space included in between the different fields or into one of the codes. And this prevents the crawler from correctly identifying the IDs or from correctly reading the file. The other question that we've received quite commonly is around subdomains, and I was alluding to that a bit earlier. So for example, if you do not own the root domain and you're unable to put an ads.txt file there, or if, for example, you own the root domain but you would like different seller IDs to be authorized for different subdomains, what should you do? Google will crawl subdomain files, but they need to be referenced in the root domains, and they need to be indicated by subdomain equals and the name of that subdomain. And just to be very concrete and very clear with an example, I was saying earlier, google.com is a root domain. If let's say you have a website on the root domain, if you define all the subdomains, for example, continuing this analogy, maps.google.com is one of the subdomains, or news.google.com. You list them out in the ads.txt file placed on the root domain. And then on each of these subdomains, you can upload a separate ads.txt file with all the relevant information of the sellers authorized on that specific subdomain. But it's very important to have all the subdomains that you want to be checked by the crawler, that have a separate ads.txt file that needs to be checked. You need to define them in the root domain ads.txt file. And I was mentioning there is some news around ads.txt for apps. On November 30th, the AIB Technology Lab released the app ads.txt specification in a beta phase. It's a long-awaited app guidance for ads.txt. It can increase the pool of authorized inventory while reducing fraud, also in the app space. And it is currently available in a public comment phase until February of next year. This has been announced last week, and it applies to ad transactions in mobile apps, but as well as over-the-top OTT video apps. It can help and identify and also block all the instances of unauthorized developer impersonation as well. So stay tuned to find more news about that, also about how you should integrate moving forward ads.txt in apps. But at the moment, this is a very early stage of this launch, and it's all the relevant information is available on the AIB Tech Lab webpage. With this, I would conclude. I would say thank you, and I think we can move to a few questions. Checking them right now. So just bear with me for a moment. as I go through them. So one question coming from Amber, for example, why ads.txt file is important? Is there any drawback if we don't add the file? I think I've covered that in the presentation, but just to summarize, it is important because it increases transparency overall in the system, in the ads ecosystem. But for you particularly, it is important because more and more buyers are choosing to only buy authorized inventory, which means if you are not publishing an ads.txt file, you will be considered a non-participating publisher. And there could be more and more of the advertising spend that is going only through authorized, which translates into a loss of revenue or a loss of opportunity for you from a monetization perspective. Another question, what does the fourth field mean in the ads.txt? So in the syntax of the ads.txt, as I was saying, there are three fields that are mandatory and the fourth one that is optional. The fourth one is an ID associated with the exchange or the SSP. Now, currently is the tag ID. It is essentially another way of identifying the SSP through an ID rather than the name, which is the first field. But because the first field is mandatory, then the last one is just a way to check the specific ID. It's optional, and if you don't include it, it does not affect in any way the efficiency or the functionality of your ads.txt file. Another question that we received, let me just see the full question. How do we implement an AdSense account and GFP account into one file? Well, I would say you're referring to both. The user is Brent that asked this question. You are referring to how do you include both the IDs of AdSense and Ad Manager into one file, or how do you verify if the file is correct? So if you included the AdSense publisher ID in your ads.txt file in the AdSense account, you would see if there are any errors. If you also work with Google Ad Manager, which is the new name for DFP, then there you have a different publisher ID that you would need to include in the file as well. And through the interface of Google Ad Manager, you have an ads.txt generator, and you also have all the information around validating your current ads.txt file. So for example, you might see there that your ads.txt file doesn't contain all the IDs required or is not correctly authorizing your ID, and then you can action on it. So there's very granular information in that validating section of Ad Manager that tells you if we encountered any error and what is the recommended action in order to fix it. Is there an, Joe is asking, is there an online way to validate your ads.txt configuration, like for example, validating HTML or AMP content? I think in the case of AdSense, the easiest way to validate is to check your account, your AdSense account. And if you don't have any errors highlighted, then it means from an AdSense perspective, the file is correct. Of course, it's very important to mention that all these instructions and these details that I'm providing refer to your AdSense publisher ID and making sure this is correctly included into your ads.txt file. If you work with multiple networks, exchanges, SSPs, then it's important to include one line for each of them and to reach out to them or check out the respective documentation from each of them on how to correctly configure their ID, their code within your ads.txt file. So from that perspective, in your AdSense account, you would validate that your AdSense publisher ID is correctly configured and read and understood by the system, but you wouldn't fully validate if any other codes included there are correctly configured. For that, at the moment, there is no recommendation that I can make from a Google perspective. I think one more question from Winda. I have some blogs, but only one with customdomain.com, the other using Blogspot from Google. Do I have to add add.txt for all of them, or only the one with the domain? For the one with the domain, you absolutely need to add ads.txt if you want to authorize your inventory on the root domain. For the others, on our help center, there is a specific set of instructions that you can find for working in this type of CMS. And we can follow up afterwards. Also, I can include links in the presentation with more details for your specific scenario. I think that is it. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to present to all of you, and looking forward to the next session. Thank you.